For 70 years, one promise held across the democratic world. If you reached its border and said the word asylum, someone had to listen. Poland just stopped listening. In March 2025, it did what no European Union country had ever quite dared. It passed a law suspending the right to even ask for asylum along its border with Belarus, not slowing it, not screening it, switching it off. For thousands of migrants from the Middle East, lured to that border with a promise, it was a door they were certain would open, slammed, bolted, and backed by a wall. And Brussels blinked. To understand how one of Europe's newest democracies came to suspend one of the oldest rules of the democratic world, you have to understand that this story does not begin with a cruel law. It begins with a trap and a dictator who built it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what Poland did, why it did it, what it means for the right to asylum across Europe, and why the loudest version of this story, the one about a wave of Muslim migrants stopped at the gate, misses the far stranger, far more uncomfortable truth about what actually happened at Europe's hardest border. Start in the summer of 2021, on the frontier between Poland and Belarus. A long, wild line of forest and marsh that most Europeans could not find on a map. That summer, something began to change there. Migrants from Iraq, from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Yemen and Somalia started appearing at the wire in growing numbers. They had not walked across a continent, they had flown. Into Minsk, the capital of Belarus, on tourist visas, often routed through Istanbul on state-linked airlines, sold travel packages by middlemen who promised an easy road into the European Union. And the man who opened that road was Alexander Lukashenko, the authoritarian ruler of Belarus. In 2020, Lukashenko had claimed a rigged election that much of the world refused to recognize. When protests erupted and the West imposed sanctions, he looked for a way to hit back. In May 2021, his regime forced down a Ryanair passenger jet flying through Belarusian airspace, using a false bomb threat and a fighter escort, just to arrest a dissident journalist on board. The sanctions tightened, and Lukashenko reached for a weapon that costs almost nothing and hurts deeply: human beings. He would gather desperate people, fly them to his capital, bus them to the European border, and push them toward the wire. Knowing that Europe would either let them in and fracture over it, or push them back and be accused of cruelty. Either way, Europe would bleed. The European Union and NATO gave it a name: hybrid warfare, the weaponization of migration, using refugees as ammunition against a democracy. This is the first thing you must hold on to, because it is true and it is inconvenient. The people arriving at Poland's border in 2021 were not a random wave. They were, in large part, deliberately sent, instrumentalized by a hostile state as an act of aggression. Poland did not imagine that threat. It was real. In 2021, Polish border guards recorded around 40,000 attempts to cross from Belarus. And Poland's response set the tone for everything that followed. In September 2021, it declared a state of emergency along the border and sealed off a strip of land 3 kilometers deep, barring journalists, aid workers, and human rights monitors from the zone. Whatever was going to happen at that border, it would largely happen in the dark, unwatched. Then, Poland began to build. Along 186 kilometers of frontier, it raised a steel wall 5.5 meters high, topped with coils of razor wire at a cost of around 1.5 billion zloty. It was finished in the summer of 2022. Then came the technology, a second electronic barrier stretching over 200 kilometers, wired with some 3,000 cameras, motion sensors, and night vision. And in 2024, Poland announced something bigger still, the Eastern Shield, a 10 billion zloty program to fortify its entire eastern edge against Belarus and Russia. Bunkers, sensors, anti-tank defenses. The message was total. This border would not be crossed. And on the other side of that wall, people died. Human rights groups who managed to track it. Grupa Granica, the Helsinki Foundation, others, documented dozens of deaths in the border forest, a toll that climbed past 100 by early 2025, with hundreds more reported missing. People died of hypothermia in the freezing Białowieża woods, drowned in the marshes, collapsed from exhaustion. Doctors from Médecins Sans Frontières treated more than 400 people pulled from that zone and said roughly half bore injuries related to violence. Among the trapped were families, children. People pushed back and forth across the line by both sides, like a ball in a game they did not choose to play. Because this is the second truth, and it sits uneasily beside the first. The migrants at that border were victims twice over, lured and used by Lukashenko as a weapon, and then met by a wall, a blackout, and, increasingly, a shove back into the forest. They were pawns of a cynical dictator and casualties of a democracy's defense at the same time. For years, this was the grim, frozen standoff. And then, in the spring of 2024, the temperature changed. On the 28th of May, 2024, a 21-year-old Polish soldier named Mateusz Sitek was stabbed through the border fence with a knife lashed to a pole. He died of his wounds days later. A young man in uniform killed defending the line. For Poland, it was a breaking point, proof in blood that this was not a humanitarian queue, but a front. And when, soon after, Polish prosecutors charged several soldiers for firing warning shots at migrants storming the barrier, the country erupted. Across the political spectrum, Poles asked how a soldier could be prosecuted for defending a border under attack. The government moved to expand the legal protections for soldiers who use their weapons there. The mood had hardened into something close to consensus. The border must hold, whatever it takes. And whatever it takes is how Poland arrived at the line it would cross. In October 2024, the government of Prime Minister Donald Tusk unveiled a new migration strategy with a blunt title: Regaining Control. Buried inside it was a proposal that made human rights lawyers across Europe sit up. Poland would give itself the power to temporarily suspend the right to receive asylum applications, to switch off in a defined place and time the ability to even ask. Understand who was proposing this. Donald Tusk is not a nationalist firebrand. He is a pro-European centrist, a former president of the European Council, the very heart of the Brussels establishment. And here he was, proposing to suspend a pillar of European refugee law. That is how completely the politics of migration had shifted. Tusk had watched the nationalist right rise on this issue, and he chose to take the issue away from them by out-toughening them. In February 2025, he declared flatly that Poland would not implement the European Union's new migration pact if it meant accepting relocated migrants. Poland, he said, would not be told whom to take. The law itself moved fast. On the 21st of February, 2025, Poland's parliament passed it by an overwhelming margin. On the 26th of March, President Andrzej Duda signed it, and the very next day, the government issued the regulation that switched it on: a 60-day suspension of the right to claim asylum along the Belarus border. Here is what that law actually does, precisely, because precision matters. When migration is being instrumentalized by a hostile state, and when it poses what the law calls a serious and real threat to security, the Polish cabinet can issue a regulation suspending the right to lodge an asylum application at that border. It runs for up to 60 days at a time. Extending it requires a vote of parliament. It is not, on paper, absolute. It carves out exceptions. Unaccompanied children, pregnant women, people who are seriously ill or elderly, people who would face real harm if sent back to Belarus, and, pointedly, citizens of Belarus itself. For everyone else who crosses in that zone, the law's meaning is stark. You may reach Polish soil, you may say the word asylum, and no one is legally required to hear it. To grasp why that is a line, you have to understand what it broke. The right to seek asylum is not a Polish invention or an EU regulation. It runs back to the 1951 Refugee Convention, written in the shadow of the Second World War, when Europe, having turned away the desperate and watched them die, swore it would build a rule so that no one fleeing for their life could simply be turned back without a hearing. That principle has a name: non-refoulement. You do not return a person to danger without first listening to their claim. It is one of the load-bearing walls of the entire post-war human rights order. And Poland, a country that itself produced millions of refugees in the 20th century, had just declared that at one border, for a while, that wall did not apply. The reaction from the guardians of that order was immediate and furious. The United Nations Refugee Agency warned, before the vote, that the law would put Poland in breach of international and European law, and that border guards are not judges. They cannot be the ones to decide who deserves protection at the moment of a shove. Human Rights Watch told Poland to scrap the bill outright and called on Brussels to punish it. Amnesty International called the suspension a flagrant violation of international law, a legal codification of the very pushbacks that had already been filling the forest with the dead. The Council of Europe's Human Rights Commissioner condemned it. Poland's own Helsinki Foundation called it unconstitutional. And here is where the story turns from a Polish story into a European one, because of what Brussels did next. Rewind 5 years. In April 2020, the European Union's highest court had ruled that Poland, along with Hungary and the Czech Republic, had broken European law by refusing to take in its share of refugees during the 2015 migration crisis. Back then, Poland had accepted essentially zero. The EU's position was clear. Solidarity was mandatory, and turning refugees away was illegal. Now watch what happened in 2024 and 2025. When Poland proposed suspending asylum, the European Commission at first reminded Warsaw that access to asylum must be guaranteed under all circumstances. But then, the ground shifted. In October 2024, the leaders of the European Union, the European Council, effectively backed Poland, declaring that exceptional situations require appropriate measures. By December, the Commission issued a communication that was widely read across the continent as a political green light, even as it murmured about non-refoulement and human dignity. The same union that had dragged Poland to court for refusing refugees was now, in effect, blessing Poland for refusing to hear them. That is not a small shift. That is the center of European politics moving in real time on the most fundamental question of who Europe lets in. And Poland pressed its advantage. It refused the new migration pact's core bargain that states either take relocated asylum seekers or pay around 20,000 euros per person they decline. Poland said it would do neither, arguing that it had already carried Europe's heaviest load by hosting around 1 million Ukrainian refugees. And Brussels agreed. By late 2025, the EU listed Poland among the countries to be exempted from taking relocations at all. Then, in July 2025, Poland reimposed border checks with Germany and Lithuania, tightening the net further. The country that Brussels had once punished was now setting the pace. But to tell this story honestly, we have to hold up the part that the triumphant version leaves out. Two parts, really. The first is the double standard, and it is impossible to ignore. Poland took in almost none of the mostly Muslim refugees of 2015, and then, after February 2022, opened its arms to around 1 million refugees from Ukraine, more than almost any country on Earth. Christian, European, mostly women and children fleeing a war next door. Critics call that a religious and ethnic filter dressed up as security policy. Poland answers that the two are simply not comparable, that Ukrainians are fleeing an organic war on its doorstep, while the Belarus route is a manufactured attack by a hostile regime. Both of those things can be true at once, and the honest viewer has to sit with the discomfort of that. What is not in doubt is the backdrop of opinion. Surveys have found around 2/3 of Poles holding an unfavorable view of Muslims, in a country where Muslims are barely 1 in 1,000 people, a tiny community centered on Tatars who have lived there for 600 years. Poland's fear of Islam has always been, to a striking degree, a fear of a population that is hardly there. Which brings us to the second, harder truth, the one hiding inside this video's own title. The story is usually told as Poland stopping a wave of Muslim migrants, with the quiet implication of a terrorist threat held back at the gate. But when analysts actually look for that threat, they struggle to find it. Independent counterterrorism researchers have noted that the people crossing from Belarus have produced no documented terrorist attacks, echoing what the data showed after 2015, that the feared wave of refugee terrorism largely never materialized. The genuine threat at that border is real, but it is a different kind of threat. It is geopolitical. It is a hostile dictatorship using human beings to destabilize a neighbor. It is hybrid war, and Polish officials, like many politicians across Europe, have every incentive to blur those two things together, to let a border security fight against Lukashenko be felt by the public as a civilizational fight against Islam. The wall is aimed at Minsk. The fear it feeds on is aimed at mosques that in Poland barely exist. So who is right about Poland? There is a Poland that looks at a dead soldier, a wall under nightly assault, a dictator flying in human ammunition, and a Europe that spent decades lecturing it, and says, we are the ones actually defending this continent, and we will not apologize for it. To this Poland, suspending asylum is not cruelty. It is closing a loophole that a hostile state was deliberately exploiting, and the tears of Brussels are a luxury paid for by countries that never had a Lukashenko on their doorstep. And there is another Poland, and much of the human rights world that looks at the same border and sees a country that let a dictator's cynicism become an excuse to bury one of the oldest promises in international law, in a forest full of unmarked graves.
To this side, a right that can be switched off in an emergency was never really a right at all. And a Europe that cheers it on is quietly deciding that the 1951 promise has an expiration date. Both of these are describing something real. That is what makes this the hardest border in Europe. Not the wall, but the argument on top of it. Here is what is not in dispute. More than a year after it was supposed to be temporary, Poland's suspension of asylum is still in force, extended again and again by Parliament, upheld by a Polish court, and normalized a little more with each renewal. A new nationalist president, Karol Nawrocki, took office in 2025, promising to go further still. Migration, once the wedge that split Polish politics, has become the one thing nearly everyone agrees on.
And the rest of Europe is watching very, very closely. Because if Poland can suspend the right to asylum, survive the legal storm, and win Brussels' blessing, then it has written a template. Any country facing pressure at its border now has a precedent for switching off the rules. That is the line Poland crossed. Not a wall of steel, Europe is full of those now. A line in the law itself. The idea that the right to ask for refuge is absolute. That it cannot be turned off, no matter who is knocking or why. Poland turned it off. Brussels blinked. And the door that 70 years of European conscience swore would always open a crack is, at one cold border in the forest, now simply closed. The question hanging over the continent is no longer whether Poland went too far. It is whether Poland went first.